Hello. I've drawn a webcomic for a number of years now, and I'll add a link to it in the description. But I just thought I would make a video and share my process, my particular style for creating a webcomic. I do not plan on necessarily talking throughout this entire video, but just basically when the moments warrant it. And I'm not I'm not English. I can't keep up the British accent. I know how you guys like the British accent. Can't do it. So you're just gonna have to deal with my boring accent. But yeah, that's all true. I created a web comic years ago, and I've done it on and off again, very inconsistently, never taken it too seriously. And in this video, in fact, I'm really out of practice. It's been, actually, you can look at my webcomic. Last time I made one was, I think, in May of 2012. I've done a little drawing here and there since then, but I really have let it go. You can see there in the hands, I knew the hands were going to be pretty small anyway, so as far as in the final drawing, so I didn't worry too much about the detail there, but nonetheless, I could have done much better than that before. I really shouldn't let it go like I have, and I've had to keep redrawing lines here. You see me over and over again redrawing lines, and that really slows things down and makes it less fun, but it's my own fault for, letting my skills fade a little bit. But that's okay. It's kind of like riding a bike, not quite that simple, but I'll get it back. But I really want to improve well beyond where I'm at now. The problem with a webcomic is to get popular and remain popular, you really need to update at least once a week, bare minimum. Better 3 times a week. There's no way I could ever see myself doing 5 times a week. But 3 times a week is a reasonable goal, but I have to speed up my process quite a bit for that, because generally for a full webcomic it takes me about 3 hours to 5 hours, depending on the complexity of the background, the foreground, and what I'm trying to get across, or if I'm drawing a lot of hands and feet. The length of this process has really dissuaded me from being consistent with it, having a consistent update schedule. And for a while I was somewhat consistent, and May, I think, was my most consistent month of last year, I had the best following then that I've ever had. So I can see where consistency makes a huge difference. But the time it takes, it's hard to spend 6 hours a day, 3 days a week, creating a webcomic. What I can and should do is spend a little less time on the details when I'm making a webcomic, and I could probably pull it out in about 2 hours. And then as I get faster, I can add more detail. That would be the smart thing, but it's hard for me to do that. I feel like unless I'm putting out my best art, then I'm wasting my time. We'll see. Maybe I'll try that. Maybe I'll try just letting go a little bit. For the moment, I'll focus a little more on the actual drawing that's going on here. I've created this drawing as a thumbnail for my other YouTube video, Lara Croft refrigerator. It's a little elaborate for a thumbnail, for sure. I got a little carried away. In the future, I need to refine that process some and make a much smaller, much less detailed drawing for that purpose. As you can see, I'm pretty much done with the inking now, and I've moved on to coloring the drawing. I always enjoy the coloring part of the process because everything really starts to come together then. Here on the gun handle, again, you have to realize this whole thing is supposed to be a YouTube thumbnail, so some of the coloring detail I go into is completely pointless. That could have all been one color, and this part especially in the middle here of the clip, I don't know why I bother. I should have just colored all that gray. And it's not like it takes a lot of time, but I went back and colored the bullets inside the clip. Totally pointless, but you never know also when you might want to blow up the picture to be something bigger. But at the same time, if I did that, then the hands and the gun itself wouldn't look so good. So unless you're going to go into detail on everything and make it refined, then you shouldn't really waste the time to do that with any of it. But it only took a second, that sort of thing. It doesn't take very long just to change the colors up, and so why not? Now here in her hand, she's holding nothing in her right hand right now, and that's where she's going to be holding the chicken leg or whatever it's supposed to be. I used to ink absolutely everything, but I've gotten to where now recently I've changed to a technique where I still do the majority of the drawing with an ink outline, but some parts now, like the chicken leg or whatever it is she's holding, I like to do with no ink outline, and you'll see coming up a large portion of the background has no ink outline, and I kind of like the effect that gives it. Having everything with an ink outline looks a little too busy, and this also adds a little visual variety. An added bonus is that it's much faster, not having to ink everything. Like many longtime gamers, I've played every Tomb Raider there is. I haven't beaten them all, but I've at least played them all. The reason why I'm saying that is because of what I do right here when I color her eyes. I just took a guess. Green. I don't know. I had never really thought about her eye color. At this point, I looked it up and found out her eyes are in fact brown. So, forgive me for that. That's why there's this long pause. Then I changed the colors. Eventually, anyway. Obviously, this drawing was made to look as goofy as possible, so I had the big, buck teeth. In general, I prefer doing the goofy drawings over the more realistic or literal drawings. I like attempting those too. I'm not that great at them yet, and that's largely because I haven't tried them very much. I just enjoy, having a different take on a character. It's fun for me. I messed up here a couple times, again, because it's been a while since I'd done this. If you just use the paint bucket to ink an area, sometimes, most of the time in fact, it'll leave a white line around it. Maybe there's a better technique out there than what I know of, but what I tend to do is I just use the magic wand to select the area, expand it a bit, and then color behind it, and that usually works pretty well for me, almost flawlessly. Looking back on this now, I realize I could have done something more with the eyebrows. Just a couple lines. But again, it was meant to be a thumbnail, so it's lacking a little detail there. Still bugs me though. Pretty much all the flat colors now are done except for on the bow, and of course here I'm adding the, I'll just call it a chicken leg for simplicity. But all the flat colors are pretty much added, and a lot of times people stop at that. Really, I guess if you're doing a webcomic that you're putting out once a week, 3 times a week, or especially every day, that's probably a pretty good place to stop. But there's a few things you can do that add a lot to it that make it really, pop a little bit more, which I'll be doing coming up here pretty soon. Well, after the bow, which I take entirely too long coloring in the bow. Don't really know why I did it like that. I'm still pretty new to this technique, so it took me a bit. And actually it's because I've been playing the game Draw Something, and you can't use layers in that. You can't create an ink outline and then color it in, at least not very well. You could put the color first and then the ink outline, but there's really no point in that. And I found certain techniques that work pretty well in that game, and of course in this Photoshop you get a lot more control. So that's why I started doing it. Or that's where I got the idea from. And I then wonder why I never did it this way before, except that it's just the way I learned watching other videos of, of other webcomic artists. And then I realized I need to watch a greater variety of uh, webcomic artists and artists in general. I can learn a lot from that. I really did not put much effort into this bow, for sure. Like a piece of wood on her back. I have very little experience drawing backgrounds. That's because, for the longest time, if you look at my early webcomics, they had pretty basic backgrounds, pretty bad backgrounds, so for a while there I pretty much just stopped doing them, or at least put in any real effort into them at all. And I regret that. I regret spending all my time drawing basically just characters, because it was like learning to draw all over again when I wanted to start creating backgrounds for different projects like this. I think really though this is probably my best background to date, which unfortunately isn't part of this video because it took me about as long as this drawing did, maybe longer. I can't remember exactly. I didn't record it because one, I expected it to come out not so great, and two, I knew I would make a lot of mistakes along the way, but I don't know, for some reason it worked out better than this drawing in the sense of how many mistakes I made. Maybe I'm finally learning a bit in that area. You actually have so much more freedom with the background and what you can do with it, and it being perceived as decent or even good versus a character. There's such variety in landscapes and backgrounds, and again, it's the background. People, I think, by and large, don't care too much about that, at least in a webcomic, and that's where my mentality is still at when I'm doing this. So what I'm doing here is I created a black image over her on another layer. Then I changed the opacity, and then you can start removing parts of that with an eraser. And this way you're adding light instead of adding shadow. And for characters that are in a lot of shadow versus out in the daylight, it really works better to add the highlighting that way instead of what a lot of people do, which is have a regular character and then on another layer add shading to them. It's mostly shaded in this instance, so it just makes sense to do it this way, I think. And I've started doing that a lot recently in a lot of different drawings. I really like the effect. I forgot to add a couple things to her in this video. I had meant to put some kind of reddish highlights into her hair and maybe have a couple strands of hair hanging down into her face and just adding some texture to the clothing. I went back and did that. I always tend to go back and edit pictures that I create. Unfortunately, those changes aren't on this video, but you can see it at my webcomic website. And we're just about at the end here, and I'll be adding the background pretty soon, which is already completed, as I said. Thanks for taking the time to watch this. I really appreciate it, and I would also appreciate any feedback you might have for me. Like if I'm talking too much, I felt like maybe I was, but you could always mute it and listen to your music or something, I guess. Anyway, thanks.